Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. I just got back from All Things Open in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I had a really great time. While I was there, I delivered a speech about 10 things I wish I knew about Linux before I got started, and it was awesome. I think it's an important subject because Linux can be very difficult to learn, so what I wanted to do was go over some of the things that would have made life a lot easier had I known those things before I got started, so that was the nature of the talk that I gave while I was there. Now, this was a follow-up to another video with the same title, but what I wanted to do was come up with 10 more things that I wish I knew about Linux because there's all kinds of nuances and quirks within the Linux community, so I think it's really important to narrow things down and help you guys understand what's important while you're getting started. So what I decided to do was record that talk and play it back for you guys, those of you that didn't get a chance to make it to that particular event. So what I'm going to do is play back that talk right now, so let's dive in. All right, so that looks like probably most of the people that are going to be here today. How's everybody doing? Awesome, so glad to have you guys here. So basically, we're going to talk about 10 things I wish I knew about Linux when I first started, although there's probably 20 other things. I could probably do 2 more videos about this. So like I was saying, Linux can be very overwhelming to learn because it's just such a huge industry, as I'm sure many of you know. There's distributions, there's desktop environments, there's best practices, there's commands, there's the proper way to pronounce GNOME. I know it's GNOME, but you know, I don't do that. There's all these different things. So what we're going to talk about is some of the things that would have made it a little easier for me had I knew them at the beginning. And the thing is, learning Linux was hard for me, which might surprise some people. For those of you that don't already know, I have a very popular YouTube channel that covers it. So everyone is seeing me at the other end or the other side of that. But what no one is seeing is the struggles and how hard it was coming up. I started in 2002, and I almost didn't even start. When I saw how many distributions there were, I was really curious about it, but I figured, you know, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Which one do I choose? It's just a lot. And for me, thankfully, there was a Linux class that was taught at the college I was going to back in 2002. And the instructor chose Red Hat. So, you know, my decision was made for me. So that kind of just, okay, that's what I'm using. So that kind of got me across the hump. And it's amazing how, you know, one, decision in your life can change the trajectory of everything that comes, after that. Because if I had given up on Linux just because of that one thing when I was overwhelmed at the beginning, then my entire career may not exist today. So that's, it's just amazing. So if it's hard for you, it was hard for me too. You're not alone if that's you. But first, who am I? My name is Jay LaCroix. And I have over 20 years of experience in using Linux. I started with Red Hat, I think it was 7.2, which was before Red Hat Enterprise Linux came in back when they were doing, the traditional version of it. And I even remember in the class, one of the first things that happened is we had a classroom debate about GNOME or KDE, and we had to make a general consensus in the class about which one to go with, which was probably the first impression I had of some of the debates that would then come years later. I also have 20 years of experience in enterprise IT. When I say I started in Linux 20 years ago, I was using it, I was obsessed with it, but as many people were back then, and many of you probably are now, I was a Windows system admin, started help desk, and then worked my way up. When I first started, you'd be lucky to see a Linux job. You might see one Linux job and then like 20 Windows system administrator positions when you're looking for a job. And now it's kind of interesting because Linux has taken over servers and it's just exploded. It may not have a huge presence on the desktop, but it does now have a huge impression on servers. I've also written 6 Linux-related books. I'm currently working on one right now that's at the very, very beginning stages, so I don't have a whole lot to say about that right now. What I will say is that the book that I'm writing is going to be more entry-level because I wanted to write something more for people that are starting out. So it's basically how to migrate to Linux from a proprietary operating system like Mac OS or Windows. So I wanted to have that resource available. And it's going to be self-published. So I'm going to be selling directly to my people. I decided to cut the publisher out of the equation for reasons that I won't get into. But I'm also the host of Learn Linux TV, which I started quite some time ago in 2012. I started the channel in my bedroom with a point-and-shoot camera aimed at my television. And I started the channel with a budget of around $150. I bought a $15 microphone from Walmart, and I think the rest of the money was a used Dell Latitude laptop that I found at the local flea market. So that's basically my budget for getting started. But nowadays, most of you have smartphones, so you have, basically something that could do 4K video that's in your pocket, but we didn't have that luxury back then. Speaking of Learn Linux TV, I'll just spend a few minutes to talk about that. I recently surpassed 1 million subscribers on the channel, which I cannot believe. When I first started this channel, I didn't even know if I would hit 200,000 or 400,000. I kind of thought maybe 400,000 would be my peak. But luckily for me, Linux just started getting more and more popular, which is great because I love to see that. And I have a gold plaque now, which I cannot believe. And now there's over 56 million lifetime views on the channel. So apparently people care about Linux, which is great. And now it's one of, if not the largest Linux resource or Linux learning resources on the entire internet. I had produced over 1,000 videos over the course of the channel. That's not necessarily how many are there today, because sometimes a video is redone and it replaces the earlier one. But over the lifetime, I've produced over 1,000 videos, which is just amazing. And an interesting fact about that is I didn't even start editing videos until 2017. So everything before that was done in one take. I decided I did not want to edit. I thought it would be a boring thing to have to go through. So I would literally start over from the very beginning every time I messed up, and that was not very practical. However, when I learned how to edit videos, I realized it's actually not that bad, and I quite enjoy it. And then I found out I really enjoy it, and it became a creative outlet for me as well. And I love my job. I'm very grateful for it. The fact that I was able to create a platform that would not only become such a huge resource all over the world. I mean, there's countless countries that are watching my content all over the place, and that's just incredible to me. And I absolutely love my job, and I appreciate everyone that supported me and helped me create that platform, because without you guys, there wouldn't even be a Learn Linux TV for me to do every day. So I really appreciate that. So what makes Linux difficult to learn? I have already touched on a few of the things, but it is a ginormous platform. It has its own quirks, its idiosyncrasies. There's lots to learn. There's lots of debating. Should I use Ubuntu? Should I use Debian? Which distribution is great for servers? Which one should I use on a brand new computer, an older computer, my Raspberry Pi? Which one should I sideload onto my phone? I mean, there's just so many different things to keep track of, which when someone who's starting out looks at all this, it's just like, where do I start? Which direction do I go? And then there's also other things within the community, like, DevOps and things like that too. Maybe it could be a security analyst, an ethical hacker. There's so many different things within the Linux community. So there's directions within the directions, so to speak. And depending on your distro, it's really hard to know the exact number, but I think it was closer to between 2,000 to 4,000 commands and binaries in the average Linux distribution. Obviously, if you're using Arch, you only have the binaries that you wanted because you built your system from scratch, Gentoo even more so. But for the most part, with all the commands and things that you can learn, it's just really hard to figure out which one should I learn. Should I learn everything? And then some people ask me, how do you memorize all these commands? We'll get to that. And there's somewhere, again, these numbers, you could kind of argue this a little bit. You can kind of debate it, and that's fine. But I was able to estimate, or I should say guesstimate, around 20 options per command on average, and quadruple that, or actually probably 10 times that if it's rsync. And like I mentioned a few times, hundreds of distributions exist. If you go on DistroWatch, there's 100, but I think they keep track of closer to 300 distributions. You just see the top 100 clicked distributions when you go to that site. So it's definitely a huge platform. And I'm probably not going to run out of things to cover. I get asked this question a lot, like, Are you going to get to a point where you've covered everything you want to cover and then the channel ceases to exist? No, I'm always finding out new things to cover. And I usually have around 75 ideas on my list that I pick from every time I go to record a video, some of which have been there for like 3 years. So there's definitely a lot to cover. And even if I did manage to cover everything, which won't happen, there's new things coming out all the time. I mean, containers weren't even a thing when I started. Well, technically they were, but they were more of a thing later when Docker got a hold of it and put a buzzword on it. But it's actually not as hard as you might think. And what I think we should do is focus on cutting through the noise, focus on what's important, and then, basically make your direction to focus on the things that interest you. And when you really focus on what's important to you, what increases your dopamine, it's really not that bad, as we're going to see as we go through these. But starting right now, we're going to go through the 10 different things, or 10 of the things that I wanted to know when I first started that would have made my life a lot easier. And the first one is something that I mentioned in a previous video. I did a video, 10 things I wish I knew about Linux, and I tried to focus this time on giving you guys something new. So I'm trying not to cover the things that I've covered before in that video in case you guys have already seen it. However, a few things will still be on this list because I think it's important. And the first of those is to always have a plan B distribution, have an alternate. And this goes for both, people that just use Linux, as a residential basis, you're using it at home as your daily driver. It's even worse if you use it at work because, switching distributions is hard. But the thing is, distributions change over time. The projects go in different directions. And I'm not going to say anyone's doing a bad job or anything like that. Every project has their goals and the things that they're trying to accomplish. But distributions today are not what they were before. And when a distribution ages over time, sometimes, you want to go along with that direction. Other times you may not like that direction. I'm not going to judge anything again, but, with Ubuntu going to snap packages, which I'm not going to judge. I think it's a great technology, but it's not for everyone. So with a distribution going in that direction, you may not want to go that direction. And sometimes it gets harder and harder to force a distribution to be something that it's not. And, for example, if you don't enjoy snap packages, you have to spend time removing that from your system. And there's other examples too, like for example, support ended on CentOS 8 all of a sudden when it was promised that support would go on for a longer period of time. And CentOS Stream is the new normal. And I think CentOS Stream is great. No judgment about that at all. But if that's not a direction that you or your company wants to go, then, like I said, things change. And changing distros isn't easy. It's one of those things where, from a residential standpoint or a general user standpoint, it's not that hard. But if you think about companies, it can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to switch. You could have 100 servers, tens of thousands of servers, and then if the time comes to change a distribution, that's a huge workload. You have to test everything all over again, and having a plan B distribution ahead of time kind of helps with that. And you're going to save time with a plan B distribution. And basically, one of the things about that is you could test it regularly in an isolated test environment. For example, in other companies that I've worked and companies that I've managed, some of the people would literally have an isolated test environment with a different distribution running the company's software, and they don't really know if they're going to actually switch to that distribution. An alternative distribution in an isolated test environment gives you a chance to see what life would be like on the other side. And then if it ever happens to where you do have to switch for whatever reason, some of that work is already done. And let me tell you, if you're a system administrator and your boss says, hey, we need to switch it to this other distribution, what do you think about that? And then you say, well, I've been testing it for the last year. I think we will be more than happy with that. That's a really great thing. But if you don't have a plan B distribution, your workload is going to be much higher. The cost is much higher. So I feel like you should always have a distribution in your back pocket, basically. So the next thing I wanted to touch on is avoiding cram sessions. And I think this is going to hit really hard for people that are studying for certifications. And you do have to cram for certifications because there is a list of things that you have to know. But when it all comes down to it, it's not a race. The thing is, quality is better than quantity. Focus on retention. If you're trying to spend 2 hours learning as much as you can, your retention is going to be bad. You're not going to remember as much. You're not going to be able to commit as much to memory. And when it all comes down to it, memorizing a couple of things a day is much more effective than trying to remember as much as possible within a few hours. You'll retain more knowledge that way. And I think retention is very important because you want to take lessons with you in your day-to-day. If you're trying to learn everything, it's just not going to be as effective. The other thing to mention too, I alluded to earlier, people ask me all the time, how do you memorize all these commands? I don't. I keep a lot of notes. No one is going to be able to memorize everything. It just can't happen. You will learn very well the things that you use every single day. But the things that you don't learn or don't use every day, you're not going to do as good of a job with those things. So you basically want to make sure you're keeping good notes for the things that you don't use every day while you focus on the things that you do use every day. And then you can always go back to your notes if you ever need to do that. For example, it might surprise some of you guys, I don't have memorized the LVM commands at all. Like, I'm not resizing volumes on servers every day. I'm lucky to do that 3 times a year. So because of that, you can ask me what's the LVM command for this or that. I'll probably be able to tell you, but I most likely won't be able to tell you the exact option or flag that you need to use to do what you need to do. When it all comes down to it, don't focus on memorizing everything because that's just not something that will happen. And if you do memorize everything, that means that you have no friends, you have no family. You basically are just in your room studying all the time, and that's just no way to learn to live life. So the next thing I want to talk about is fragmentation isn't a bad thing. Is Linux fragmented? Yes. There's desktop environments, distributions. I've said that a number of times now. You could probably play a drinking game when it comes to all the different things that are mentioned about Linux, and it would not be a good time. But that also means that we have choices. Now, why that's important? Like right now on Reddit, over and over and over again, approximately 15 times a day, people are complaining about the new Mac OS. Now, I'm not going to give you my opinion on that because it's inconsistencies that people are complaining about or UI-related things. But the thing about that is, if you use a Mac, you're using the Mac OS UI. You can't switch the desktop environment. And yes, I'm sure someone has figured out a way to overlay something on top of it, and I'm sure there's ways to do that. But when you use like Windows or Mac OS, you're basically computing the way the companies are telling you to. When it comes to Linux, we have choice. If you don't like GNOME, you can use Plasma. If you don't like that, you can use XFCE. If you're not a fan of Ubuntu, you can go to Debian. You have all kinds of choices, which means you could use your computer the way that you want to, the way that you identify with. No 2 people in this room use a computer the same way. I mean, there's going to be overlap for sure, but everyone is going to have his or her own different habits and things that's important to them. But other operating systems try to, put you into a silo. This is how you're going to use a computer. So while fragmentation might be seen as overwhelming, it's a really good thing to have choice. And I think that gives people more power than they might even realize. Now, the next one is going to surprise a lot of people. And my opinion is that it's perfectly fine to be a distro hopper. We need to stop telling people to make a decision and stick with it. If you want to use multiple distributions, that means you're curious. You want to learn more. You want to learn more about the ecosystem. And what that does is give you some benefits. It improves your worldview of the Linux ecosystem if you use multiple things. You try one distribution, another, it just really gives you an overall idea of what's out there. And maybe whatever you're using right now is great, but you might discover something even better. And I think again, we really do need to stop stigmatizing distro hopping. And it's funny because I was just curious what AI thought about this, AI. When I asked, AI basically said, you need to use one distribution and make a choice. Like, why? Why put yourself in a box if you don't want to be in one? But more importantly, at work, if you use Linux at your job, and you have a better understanding of the Linux ecosystem, you're viewed as more passionate about what you do. You're viewed as someone who knows a lot and has a general idea of what's going on. And whether or not your employer appreciates you and tells you it is important, it is of value, you do have a better understanding. And distro hopping really does give you that. It really does give you that better worldview that I think makes you more marketable. But more importantly, trying multiple distributions is fun. It helps you be engaged. You need to get your dopamine going, especially when you have all these things to learn. You need to have fun. The minute that you lose the fun aspect, you might get discouraged. You might, quit, which none of you should do. Keeping you engaged is very important because that dopamine comes back to you in energy to learn more. The more you're happy about learning, the more you're going to learn. The minute you think that it's drudgery and boring, well, you're not going to learn as much. Another thing, depending on your experience level, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, you could put your home directory in a different partition. So that makes switching distributions a heck of a lot easier, especially if you separate the OS from your files. Then you can just remove the OS, switch it to another one, you still have your files. And are there quirks about that? Sure. If your distribution that you're using right now has a brand new version of GNOME and then you decide to use something else that's using a lower version, there might be some settings that you have to redo here and there. But at least you're not going to lose your photos, your documents. And most of the time, surprisingly, even different versions of desktop environments nowadays seem to do a pretty good job of dealing with this when you're switching between versions, because every version of or distribution locks to a different version. But if you separate your files from your OS, that makes it a lot easier to switch around. This one is really important at work. When you're starting a new job, you should audit backups first. And that doesn't mean that security takes a back seat. Security is critical. But you can also argue other things are critical too. But one thing you don't want to do when you start a job is find out that some important files were missing that is important to the company. All eyes are on you, okay? The director has questions for you. And that's why I feel when you first start a job, it's important to know, and of course, obviously it depends on if you're even responsible for backups in the first place, because some companies might have a different individual that handles that for you, and maybe that's not even a factor for your job. But if it is, you should ask your team members, what is the most critical data for the company? What would ruin our day if something was lost? And you have to make sure all of that is accounted for. Of course, you should test your backups, because if you don't, they're not backups. They're just wishful thinking, right? I'm sure you've all heard this before, and I've said this probably thousands of times myself, but definitely check your backups. But when you first start a job, you really do need to know what's important and, make sure everything's accounted for. That's really important, because that conversation with your director is not something that you want to have. And when I first started, I had to have that conversation with the director. And you want to talk about anxiety, it was horrible. Now, thankfully, I was able to get the data back and everything was fine. But I learned that lesson the hard way when I was entry level, and I don't want you guys to have to learn that lesson the same way. The next one I touched on in the previous video as well, but version control is very powerful as a Linux administrator or system administrator in general. I don't really feel like so many people think this now, but it's not just for software engineers. This is for everyone. Everyone can benefit from this. In fact, even if you don't manage config files, you could put your notes in Git, because it has the added benefit that you have your notes and then you learn it that way. And there's all kinds of things that you could use version control for. My new book is in version control that I'm writing right now, and that is especially powerful because I have a history of everything that I wrote, and if I accidentally delete a paragraph, I could pull it back. But more importantly, it allows you to restore configurations on your servers if your server ever encounters an issue, and that could be very powerful. But it also acts as a history of your configuration over time, especially if you're having an issue. You can figure out when it started, who made a change to the repository, if other people work on this other than you. But also, if a breach occurs, it makes it a lot easier to find out what's been changed. And I had this happen one time because the truth of the matter is there's not one single person that can't be hacked. The only thing separating you or your company from having a breach is how persistent the threat actors are. There's so many smart people out there. They find ways. They're constantly looking. And one time I had a lesser used website that did get breached, but it was under version control. So all I had to do was git diff, and I saw every single thing that that person touched right then and there and revert the repository back, I was all set. At that point, honestly, I deleted the server because I didn't really need it. But the fact is, as long as your version control repository is protected and can't be changed, because obviously, if a threat actor finds out that you have a Git repository on the server, they're going to try to change it, or maybe even just remove the commit history if they can. But hopefully that doesn't happen, but it makes it a lot easier to find out what's been done to the server, whether that's a security issue or a configuration issue. It just makes it a lot better. So definitely use version control. That would be a great thing to do. I touched on this earlier, and the thing is, don't waste your time trying to memorize everything. You won't, okay? And even if you did, there's something new tomorrow, and then you got to memorize that, and then another thing, and then another thing. You should focus on what you need to know to accomplish your goal. What is it that you want to achieve today? So if you want to, for example, set up an Apache web server, that's a great thing to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean read an entire Apache book from cover to cover, okay? You could do that, especially if you're trying to get a certification. The reality is that you're going to memorize things that you're not going to use. You're not going to use 100% of the features of everything. And that's true even outside of Linux, because one of the things that overwhelmed me about video editing is when I had a video editor on my screen, I saw the sheer number of buttons. It was ridiculous. The sliders, the things you can adjust, the different tabs, buttons, like probably 1,000 different transitions and timings and all these different things. And that made it hard for me to want to learn to edit video. But then I used my own mentality and I learned only the things that I needed to know for the types of videos that I want to do. But coming back to Linux, unless you work for Apache or you develop the project, I just don't really think that you're going to use everything. And you want to instead focus on learning how to find information quickly instead of being a subject matter expert, okay? Some people might consider me a subject matter expert, maybe, but I also have a lot to learn. I'm learning something new every day. In fact, I learn from my audience all the time. Sometimes people send me a trick that I didn't even know. So definitely make sure that you're focusing on what you need to know to get the job done, and prioritize finding information quickly, keeping really good notes of the things that you don't do every day, because a powerful Linux admin can find what they need quick. And sure, you could read an entire book if you're that interested in the subject, but when it comes to a productivity standpoint, you might be wasting a little bit of time doing that. The next thing I want to talk about is keeping a work journal. Just keep track of the things that you do for the company on a regular basis, because you don't want anyone to take you for granted. You don't want anyone to not appreciate what you do for the company. And the mentality, oh, I'm just doing my job. Yeah, you are. But what value are you adding to the company? Sometimes people don't realize that the smallest thing that they do adds value. They ran apt dist upgrade on the server and some patches came in. Big deal. I do this all the time, right? No. There's CVEs attached to that. You protected your company potentially from some CVEs. So don't take that for granted. So keep track of the patches that you install, the maintenance that you perform, basically all the things that you do. And you don't have to write a book or anything. You could just have Vim open and save a file somewhere in your home directory and just have a date, and then also have what you did. But also when you tell somebody something, you know, for example, maybe it's not your job to deal with security issues. Maybe you have an entire team that does that, and that's really not your thing. But maybe you told somebody, hey, manager, I noticed this really big security issue. I think you need to be aware of that. And then one day, if they don't take your advice, and then they get breached because of that thing that you told them, they might say, hey, why didn't you tell me about this? I did. In fact, it was on this date and it was at this time that I told you about that. And I did let you know. But it's not just about CYA, and I'm sure you guys know what that means, although that can be a part of it. What this really does is help with performance reviews. When it's time for a performance review, you might be asked, tell me about the things that you accomplished this year. What did you do for the company this year? You have a work journal. Right before that meeting starts, you could document and write down some of the things that you did that adds value. Maybe you patched the company from 100 CVEs because you've been updating things. Maybe you noticed that boot times are lower now because you found some config that wasn't necessary that was delaying the boot process. And again, you might not think that's a big deal, so what? I saved 5 seconds, but 5 seconds over time adds up. So if you keep track of the things that you do and write it down, it really helps you see your own value to the company and not take yourself for granted. But it also helps you have that conversation with your managers to tell them about the things that you did. It's not necessarily about having an ego, although it's a performance review, it kind of is. But at the end of the day, you really do need to know what you did for the company, and every little thing you do matters. And it's important to keep that in mind. Now, similarly, command history is your friend, and this is something that I didn't know until a little later. I just used the history command when I was curious, what package I installed a few days ago. But when I first started as a Linux admin, when I got that job, it was one of the first things someone taught me. When we had a problem, the first thing he said to do, check the history. Chances are it's happened before, okay? And I've seen situations where I started the company and then there's a problem, and then 6 months earlier, that same problem happened. Maybe an update failed or something got stuck. And then interestingly enough, I see commands in the history that seem oddly similar to what I'm dealing with right now, but then I see exactly what previous administrators did. And this is especially helpful if you have an administrator that left the company and you're replacing them and they didn't keep good notes, they didn't do a good history, you're not really sure what exactly happened, but the command history is a treasure trove. But also, don't clear history unless you absolutely have to. It's okay if you have a bunch of lines of history, that's fine. I mean, how big is a text file really? And storage isn't as expensive now as it used to be. But if you clear that history, you're making it harder for anyone that comes after you. And you're also making it harder for yourself if you forgot to write down what it is you did to fix a particular problem. Again, the history is a treasure trove. It's very important. But I'm also going to talk about the most important lesson of all. I'm a big proponent of mental health. I think mental health is something that a lot of people just take for granted. People go to the doctor, they check their heart, and they check all these different things. And that's really important. I'm not negating that. But a lot of people don't pay attention to their mental health and realize it's okay to make mistakes. Every single person here has or will make a mistake. You're human, it's going to happen. And it's not an opportunity to beat yourself up over it, make yourself feel worse. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I check that first? Why did I let this happen? Those are very useless things. Sure, you need to learn a lesson and know why it happened, but not in a way where you're being abusive to yourself. And I've heard people say, I never make mistakes. I'm like, yeah, okay, really? No, you make mistakes, you just don't want to admit it. Every single person makes mistakes. I literally just told you guys about the time I started a job and important data got lost. I'm not going to lie and say that never happened and just try to make it out to be like I'm perfect. No, that absolutely happened. And I made a bunch more mistakes, later on. One time I installed a RAM module wrong, and I learned what what that burnt silicon actually smells like. And it took a week to get the smell out of the office. It happens. But instead of being down on yourself, just realize that there's a lesson to be learned, but you're not going to have any benefit by being abusive towards yourself. Just give yourself a break. Because if you don't, it basically hurts your enjoyment of your job. You can't enjoy your job if you're constantly down on yourself. And in the mental health community, they call that negative self-talk, which is actually the basis of anxiety. So you're by being down on yourself, you're creating anxiety. You're creating a nervous environment for yourself. We talk a lot about some companies out there that might not be a great company to work for because they don't appreciate their employees. What we don't realize is sometimes we aren't kind to ourselves and we create that anxiety. And that's not to say that I'm saying if you have a disagreement with your job that it's not valid and not perfectly true, but be kind to yourself. You have to do that. But more importantly, being down on yourself will make you discouraged. It'll make you start considering other types of things. Maybe I don't want to do this Linux thing anymore. I messed up bad. I can't seem to figure this out. What's wrong with me? All of that is terrible. And you're going to get discouraged. That's going to have a negative job impact for you. And if you work for a company day to day, you're spending a lot of your time there. A large amount of your life is being spent at work. And if you're making it toxic to yourself, you're creating a problem for yourself, and you're just not going to get that enjoyment then you don't have the dopamine, and then you can't learn as much, and then you're creating this domino effect that cascades and then makes everything that comes after it, really bad. And again, in the mental health community, they tell you need to pay attention to negative self-talk, and you need to catch it, and you have to redirect it towards a positive. That's what you have to do. But that's also true in IT, and it's really hard because you have all these eyes on you. Why is the system so slow? If the system is down, you have 10 people at your desk. You have ticket after ticket after ticket after ticket, all letting you know the system's down, even though you already knew that. That's a lot of pressure. And especially if you're in the MSP space and you have, a company that is relying on you to build their infrastructure, that's a lot of pressure. But don't let that be pressure. This is fun. This is going to be a learning opportunity. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to give it my all. And if I don't do something right, I'm going to write it down and learn a lesson, but I'm absolutely not going to insult myself. So definitely be kind. But more importantly, have reasonable expectations. Okay, I've said many times, pro Linux users do not memorize every command. It's impossible. So if your expectation is that you're going to memorize everything, why are you doing that to yourself? Have reasonable expectations of what you can do in this moment to learn something today without worrying so much about what you're supposed to learn 2 years from now. Obviously, you have to have a career path and a plan for the trajectory of your career, but focus on right now, have reasonable expectations, and your job is going to be a lot easier. You're going to have less anxiety, less pressure, and you're just going to be a happier person, to be honest. And that's it. Those are the 10 of the things that I think is important for new people to know. So there you go. In this video, I played back my talk from All Things Open in Raleigh, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something new that'll help you along your Linux journey. I know Linux learning can be quite difficult for those of you starting out, so it's hopeful that you've learned something that'll help you during that process. Also, I just wanted to mention that this is going to be the last video that I'm recording in this temporary space. I'm very excited to be setting up a brand new studio, and I can't wait to show you guys. In the meantime, definitely subscribe to Learn Linux TV for the latest in Linux, and I'll see you in the next video.